Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Courtney Forehand. I am CML's Training and Marketing Specialist. I want to say thank you for joining us. Today's webinar is being recorded, and the presentation materials will be posted to our website at www.cml.org underneath training materials. For those of you who are not familiar with the GoToWebinar platform, you should see a control panel to the top right of your screen. There's an orange arrow to the left of that panel, which will minimize the entire box for you. All participants have been muted for this webinar, but we encourage you to ask questions by typing them into the question box on the control panel. We will hold a Q&A near the end of the webinar as time permits. So please feel free to type the questions as you think of them throughout the presentation. At this time, I would like to hand things over to our presenter, John McKenzie.
Great, thank you so much, Courtney. I appreciate it. And thank you to CML for having me. So obviously I'm going to be speaking a little bit about redistricting. And to start, I just want to tell you a little bit about myself and the company I work for so you can understand why it is I'm talking to you. So I'm with a company we're called Flow Analytics. We are a subsidiary of a larger multidisciplinary consulting firm called Mulfoster & Alonji, or MFA. We're based in Vancouver, Washington, but we do have offices in Seattle, Portland, Denver, and Boston as well. We are Flow Analytics is a division of Mulfoster & Alonji, and we are focused on GIS and data analytics, almost entirely focused on local governments, as well as school districts. So local governments and school districts are really the bulk of our clients. We provide GIS support for the Association of Washington Cities GIS Consortium, and we also do work nationally for cities and school districts. Redistricting is something that we really got into by request. We were asked, because of our clients in the sectors we worked in, we had been asked on occasion to help cities and towns and school districts to redistrict their city council boundaries or their school district boards. And we also do a lot of work with school districts doing attendance area redistricting. So redistricting was something we were always doing. And then with this upcoming census year, we took a look around and said, you know what, there are going to be a lot of organizations, a lot of cities, a lot of our clients and other folks who are going to need this type of service. So we decided to really, put the pedal to the metal, if you will, in terms of electoral redistricting, and we have been working on it nationally. So in 2021, we're so far working in Georgia and Washington, California. Certainly hope we will do even some work in Colorado. But the point of this is that we've been, actively focused on what's happening related to redistricting this year, which obviously has some unique challenges. So with that, I am going to give you a little bit of information about the redistricting process and how it will work for cities and towns in Colorado. So when I think about redistricting, and a redistricting project, I like to put it into two really distinct categories. There's the analysis and there's the outreach and the engagement. But what is critical is to know that these two things, while you might think about them separately, they really work hand in hand. The analysis that you do to do your redistricting is going to be heavily informed by the outreach and engagement that you do. And the analysis is also going to help inform where you focus that outreach and engagement. So even though I do like to think about them separately, and they're two equally important aspects, it is really helpful to know, and it's important to know that they need to inform one another. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about the redistricting process and some really sort of general principles with redistricting. And this varies state to state, and it can vary county to county, the specific, and really city or town to town, the specific laws related to redistricting. There's laws at the state level, there's laws at the federal level, There may very well be your own rules written into city code or something like that. However, for the most part, all of those laws, wherever they're coming from, are going to take into account the things that I have listed on this particular slide. So the first piece is that your boundaries, your election districts must, or wards really, must be population balanced. And I will talk more about what that really means in just a minute here. They must be contiguous, so they need to be all connected. And the redistricting, it must be done in compliance with all local, state, and federal laws, including the Federal Voting Rights Act. And redistricting must not be done to favor or disfavor a political party. So no gerrymandering. You must not gerrymander. Districts now should be as compact as possible. They should preserve communities of mutual interest. And communities of mutual interest are another thing that I will talk about in a bit. And districts should preserve the use of existing or natural boundaries. Okay, so what hopefully stands out to you here is that we have some rules that are musts and some rules that are shoulds. In a practical sense, what that means is that when you are doing the redistricting process, you will never sacrifice compliance with a should in order to comply with one of these rules that is a must, right? The musts always take precedence over the shoulds. So you must do those 4 things. And then you should do your best to the degree that it is feasible to comply with those final 3 rules there. And the reason it's like this is because these are gigantic puzzle pieces. That's really what redistricting is. It's a big, messy puzzle, and you're not going to be able to get it perfect. There's just no way. There's too many factors at play. But when you're faced with these decisions and trying to figure out what the right thing to do is, going back to these principles is a great place to start, and following these musts and the shoulds. So let's start with really the most fundamental part of the redistricting analysis, and that is population balancing. It's the whole point of redistricting, is to make populations of each district as equal as possible to ensure that everyone's vote counts equally. So when you're balancing population, the first thing to note here is that the population you're talking about is the total population, right? It's not some alternative measure. It's not citizens of voting age population, which is a data that you can get from the American Community Survey, which is not part of the regular census. It's a separate data product from the census, but it's not part of the census that will come out. So this reflects the use of total population, reflects the principle that city council represents all of the city's residents, not just those who are eligible to vote. And that has been upheld by the Supreme Court. So when you're doing redistricting and figuring out the population and the population balance, you're always using total population to do that. So when you go to balance your population, as I mentioned, you're trying to get the population in each district to be as equal as possible. Well, the way you figure that out is by first calculating something that is referred to as the ideal population. And that's pretty straightforward. That is just the mean population amongst all your districts. So simplified example here, if you have 100 people, you have 4 districts, the ideal population, the population that you want each district to contain, is 25, right? So it's pretty straightforward. Now, to calculate the deviation from the ideal, which is the metric you will use to determine whether or not your districts are balanced, what you do is you first calculate that ideal population, and then you take the population in each district and determine in terms of a percentage how much that population deviates from that ideal population. And then you look at the district with the greatest population and the district with the least population, and you sum those two values, the absolute value sum. And what you're looking to do is make sure that value is no more than 10%. And the 10% is really a general guide. It's been upheld at the federal level. However, in practice, what you're trying to do is make that number as close to zero as you can. As a consultant, we have never recommended a district scenario where the population balance was 10%, and quite honestly, I don't think we ever would. We want that number to be as close to zero as you possibly can. And from a city's perspective, you can think of that as risk mitigation, right? These things can be challenged in court, and the closer to zero you are in terms of population, the better position you will be in. So you always want to get that number as close to zero as you possibly can. Okay, so let's talk about communities of interest. And these are nowhere near as straightforward as population balance, but they're very important, okay? Now, unfortunately, there is no one authoritative definition for a community of interest. And by definition, really, it can vary between communities. So that does make it hard, and it does give you some decisions to make when you're going through this process. So the way that we approach this, and I found it helpful, is to look specifically at, well, first off, I've got a few quotes here. And these quotes serve as a good guide to get a sense of, okay, what is a community of interest, right? So it's a population that shares common social and economic interests that should be included within a single district for purposes of effective and fair representation, okay? Now, in the second quote, there's something that is equally important, which is that, you know, these interests need to be reflected in patterns of geography. And what that means is you need to be able to point to a community of interest on a map, right? You can say you have a community of interest, but if you can't say where that community of interest is, then it's not really a community of interest. So it's very important to be able to identify the location of your communities of interest, not just the other demographic and social and economic interest aspect, but also where is that group? Where are they on a map? And then, you know, in Colorado, with the Colorado Constitution, it does say that communities of interest considerations could include agricultural or industrial identity, water issues, transportation concerns, comparison of growth rates, right? So in Colorado, you do have some of your own guidelines around communities of interest. But there's still a lot of gray area here. So when we're working with clients, the approach that we like to take is looking at what types of things are we seeing as being considered as communities of interest in other work and in other projects. These are all public projects, right? So you can find this information. And they're arguing court cases too. So there's lots of ways to find out what types of things are, you know, routinely being considered as communities of mutual interest. So some of the things we regularly see in cities is defined neighborhoods, right? If you're a city or a town and you have defined neighborhoods, both, you know, with a name and a specific geography to them, those are going to be considered communities of mutual interest. School districts, right? If your school districts have, it could be the attendance boundaries of your school districts, or it could be a separate school district that's independent of your city and town. Those boundaries could be considered communities of interest as well. Military installations, if you have a military base or something like that, that might be a community of mutual interest. Unincorporated CDPs, probably not, something for most cities and towns in Colorado to consider. But you would want to look at special districts. If you have any special districts, water or utility districts that maybe pass through part of your city or town, those could be communities of mutual interest. Geographically concentrated minority populations, right? Pretty straightforward. Those are going to be considered communities of mutual interest. And then, you know, lastly, I put homeowners associations there because we've seen that pop up more and more. It can get a little sticky at times, particularly if you're a town where it seems like every neighborhood and every block is a homeowners association. But we have certainly seen those used as communities of mutual interest in other redistricting projects. Okay, so I'm going to start this slide with the caveat that I am not a lawyer, but I do want to touch on the Voting Rights Act and demographics. Obviously, this is a very important part of redistricting, and I know it's something that people always want to know about. So the Voting Rights Act, the best way to comply with the Voting Rights Act is to not set out to hurt voters based on their race or ethnicity. That's a pretty standard rule there, right? And if you follow that, that is your best way to mitigate any issues with the Voting Rights Act. With that said, I want to give you a bit of a visual of what a redistricting violation of the Voting Rights Act typically looks like. So most of those cases are challenged under Section 2 of the Federal Voting Rights Act, related to the dilution of minority votes, essentially, right? And so this is obviously a simplified visual, but what that looks like to someone like myself, a data person, is that in the example here on the left, you can see we have 4 districts, and you see we have the majority group and the minority group. In those 4 districts, the majority group makes up 75% of the population, and they make up the majority of the population in 75% of the districts. The minority group makes up 25% of the population, and they make up the majority of the population in 25% of the districts. Now, to the right is what vote dilution looks like. Everything in that map is the same, except for one thing, the lines, right? The amount of folks in the majority group and the minority group is the same, and where those people are located is entirely the same. However, simply because of the way the lines are drawn here, the majority group makes up 75% of the population still, but they make up the majority of the population in 100% of the districts. And the minority group still makes up 25% of the population, but now with these funky looking lines, they make up the majority in 0% of the districts. So once again, this is a simplified visual, but I think it can be effective to sort of understand what vote dilution looks like. And that is what is typically challenged under the Federal Voting Rights Act with regards to redistricting. Okay, so in redistricting analysis, those are obviously a few things. We talked about 3 things there that are very important, but there are also other factors you need to consider. And they're not as in-depth, so we can go through them fairly quickly. But the first is contiguity. I mentioned it before, right? Your districts have to all be intact. You can't have islands, except for real islands, which maybe you don't have too many. I don't know, maybe you do. Maybe you have a real island, I don't know. But if you do have real islands, then those districts should be connected by bridges, tunnels, any of the actual transportation routes that connect to the island all need to be contained within that same district. So you don't want, for contiguity, you're not looking to have districts that are divided like you see on the left. You do want them that are all together like you see on the right. Compactness. Now, compactness can be, sometimes it can just not be all that applicable to cities and towns, that sometimes the city and town shape isn't all that compact to begin with, so it's really difficult to come up with compact districts within that, outer odd looking shape. But a general rule is that you don't want districts that are unnecessarily thin or serpentine, right? They shouldn't look ridiculous, is the way I like to say. And you don't want something that looks like it does on the left. You're looking for things that look a bit more like what you see on the right, right? And there are a ton of different methods that can be used to measure compactness. And that can be helpful if you're looking at different redistricting plans that seem to be otherwise equal. You might want to consider their compactness score, but it's not something that's going to be absolutely critical to what you were doing in terms of redistricting, assuming you are satisfying all of the other requirements, specifically those the musts that I referred to. And then finally, the use of existing or natural boundaries here. So we're talking about major streets, roads, rivers, lakes. The thing to think about here is that you want to use lines that are already being used as boundaries for something else. You don't want to go and make a new boundary that nobody's ever, considered as using a boundary before. So you're going to look to other districts. You could look at precincts, things like that. See where their lines are. You're going to try to use lines that are already considered things that are boundaries. Okay, so the actual process. Here's some general guidance for you as a city or town going through this process. Our recommendation for how you would approach it. And this has particular relevance this year, probably more so than it has in past years. So first, use proven methods for an efficient process. What I mean by that really is that you don't want to wing it. This isn't something you can just do without having done some previous research about how to do it. Make sure you are putting in the time and the effort it takes to understand what needs to be done before you start doing it. Be confident in your plan with data-driven results. What that really means is let the data drive your districts. Don't draw your districts to meet some other pre-established goal or objective. Follow the data and allow that to shape the districts that you develop. Public trust, you want to earn that by being transparent. So, that's pretty obvious. If you act like you've got something to hide, you're going to look like you got something to hide and people are going to think you have something to hide. Be transparent about this. Be open. It's complicated, right? But you can tell people that and you can show them what you're doing. And if they understand that it's complicated, then they're going to understand, why you're doing the things you're doing. So be open and transparent with your approach. And then lastly, and this is really important, this is, I think, really key to doing this well, is to capture details about your redistricting effort and your plan through community-informed methodology. And what that means is don't just open your process and your plan up and be transparent, but actually listen to what people say about your plan and edit and revise your plan based upon that feedback you receive. It's one thing to just have a public meeting and people submit comments. It's another thing to actually take the value from those comments and put it into the redistricting plan. And that's what you should do, right? You should actually adjust your plan to the degree that it makes sense to do so, right? Everybody knows you might get some comments that don't make any sense. You don't have to worry about those. But typically there is some value in the comments and the things people will say about your redistricting plan. You may not be able to use all of it, but there's usually some value that you can take. And I would encourage you to do that and to bring it into your plan. And then lastly, communicate to your community that you're doing that. That you have revised the plan based on the feedback you received from them. That's a great way to make your community really have buy-in around the process. And it's also risk mitigation, right? These things do get challenged in court. And I don't have any hard data on this, but I'm willing to bet that having an open process that actually responds to the feedback of the community and that the community understands what is happening is a great way to reduce the risk of any of this being challenged in court. So when you're going through all of this, we always recommend to our clients, in order to keep these projects moving, there are really 5 key elements of the process that you should focus on and keep your attention on. The first is data collection, right? You need data to do this. So when you start doing this and yourself or working with somebody to do this, the first thing they're going to want to do is start collecting the data that they are going to need to do this. And that's more than just the census data that we are all waiting on, right? There's other information that is also very useful. You can collect information about the communities of mutual interest in your area, right? You can collect information about any sort of overlapping special districts, maybe your school district attendance areas, things that you may not be doing to drive your redistricting process, but are certainly going to inform the redistricting process. You can start collecting that now. And then of course, when the census data is available, you'll collect that as well. So that's really the first step, is data collection. Then you are gonna, whoever's doing this is gonna be cranking away. As you see with their gears there, doing the analysis, right? Taking all of that data that they have and coming up with some draft scenarios, right? And this is typically a few different redistricting plans or options that are meant to be sort of baselines for you. Say, hey, this is an idea of what one district option might look like, and here's an idea of what another one might look like. Typically, these drafts are never going to be what is eventually adopted, but they are a great starting point. And so you have these starting point draft plans, and then in order to get them right, what you need to do is bring those to the community, right? So you show those draft plans to your community, you collect feedback on them, and then you go and you revise those, right? You revise those plans based upon the input you received from the community. And then you show your revisions to the community. You explain why you made the revisions you did, how they were informed by the input you got from your community. And you do that until you get to the point that you have the plan that your city or town is ready to adopt. So once again, it's a lot more technical than this. There's a lot more details, but from a city's perspective and focusing on trying to keep this process moving, these are really 5 steps that we feel are really good to focus on. Okay, so I want to talk to you a little bit about some of the tools that are out in the market to help you do this. And there's a lot, there's probably too many. Not all of them are great. And I'm just going to quickly highlight some of the most prominent ones. First is Esri. Esri is the big GIS company. Many of cities and towns will have access to Esri. But Esri also does have a plugin to do redistricting. I think it's an additional cost. But either way, if you're trying to do this internally or you're contracting this out, most likely Esri is going to play a part in redistricting, even if they, even if you're not necessarily using strictly Esri to do the redistricting analysis. There's another tool out there called Maptitude for redistricting. Just in the interest of being honest, I really don't particularly like this tool. It's a GIS tool for GIS practitioners, and sometimes in the redistricting process, folks who are not sort of real GIS practitioners need access to the tool and to be able to work with it, and that can be a little bit tricky with Maptitude. That said, there have been a ton of redistricting processes done with Maptitude, probably more so than any other tool out there, right? So there's a lot of successful projects that have been done with Maptitude, despite the fact that it's not my favorite of the tools. Districtor is a new one, and this is one I do like. It's mostly online through a browser. There's a free version available that you can try out. It is focused a bit more on being a bit more user-friendly to a non-technical, non-GIS trained folks, so that is helpful. And lastly, I just want to mention a tool that our company has developed, which is called District Scenario Modeler. And really what we've done is we said, we want to make something that's as user-friendly as possible, because it does help inform your community engagement when people can interact with the maps that you're putting together. And but it's really a string of different tools that we find work best in different areas. We put them all together and bundle them into a tool that we call the District Scenario Model. So those are a few of the tools that are out there in the market to help with your redistricting. But now I want to talk about outreach and engagement. And when you start doing outreach and engagement, what is important to do is to first think about what is needed in your community to have a fair and transparent process that will earn the trust of your residents. Because your plan is ultimately going to be judged by the people in your community. You want them to trust that you're doing this in their best interests. So that can vary from place to place. It does vary from place to place. And so it's important that you think about that. some of the recommendations that we make are to do a community engagement strategy. So go beyond just making this public and doing it as part of your regular public meeting routine. Go out and identify, who do you need to reach out to? What community groups should you contact so that they are aware that the redistricting process is happening, that they are aware of how it's going to happen, and most importantly, they're going to be aware of when, where, and how they can provide input and inform the process. We'd also recommend doing some meetings before you ever draw maps. So have a meeting for your community about redistricting to tell them the things I just said, right? To tell them, hey, this is what redistricting is. This is why we're doing it. This is why we're doing it now, or when you're doing it. This is how it is done. You know, you can give them a presentation just like the one I'm giving. To say, this is how redistricting is done. These are the factors, the elements, and the things we have to consider when we're doing it. You know, explain to them that not everybody's going to be happy. There are just too many competing interests and too many competing things you have to deal with to make everyone happy. But explain to them what the process is, and do that before you ever start drafting any of your plans. Online mapping tools. There's a ton of tools out there now to put maps out online and allow people to explore, right? So if you have those draft mapping scenarios and options, put them on your website, put them anywhere, right? Get them up online and allow people to dive into the data and explore. That's not something that wasn't really even 10 years ago. It was available, but not nearly as easy to do as it is now. So take advantage of that. And then lastly, of course, I already hit on this, but more than just collecting the feedback and public comments, which you obviously need to do, but go a step further and use that to actually refine your district maps. I always think of it as, I'm a data nerd. I can go on the internet, if I'm doing this, and I can download census data, demographic information. I can download lots of data. I cannot go and download very specific details about the community that can only come from people in the community themselves. And without that, that is such a key piece of data that I don't have. I can't possibly draw you the best districts for your community, right? So make sure that you are treating that public information you're gathering as an actual data source and incorporating it into your analysis. All right, let's talk about some specifics for Colorado, and a shout out to CML here, because they put out, and I think it was shown here as an attachment for this presentation, a very useful resource related to redistricting for local governments in Colorado. And so, in Colorado, we have the Accurate Resident Redistricting Act. That was recently passed. And this isn't, this is Colorado specific, but this same thing is happening in other states as well. And what it does is it reassigns prisoners to their last known residence in Colorado prior to incarceration. And you may want to check with your county auditors perhaps might have a bit more information about what the numbers look like. So with some of our clients in other states that are doing this, the counties do have some information about what it does to the population of the county, about how many additional people are we talking. So that's something you might want to speak with your county about. But that's the Accurate Residence for Redistricting Act. A few other things that are a bit unique to Colorado, or very specific anyway. Ward boundaries, right, cannot be changed more than once in 6 years unless they are necessary to conform to constitutional apportionment requirements. And so one of the reasons I just want to highlight that is there are in some states we have seen people rushing to redistrict now because maybe they have to comply with some deadlines related to a upcoming election or primary or something like that. And then they plan to once again redistrict once the actual data comes in and make adjustments if needed. And they would, preliminary redistrict based on other data, not the census data. You can't really do that in Colorado. Hopefully, none of you are in that situation, but that's not something you can do. You can only update your boundaries once every 6 years. And then the boundaries are going to need to be adopted, and they can only be changed by a majority vote of all members elected to the governing body. Ward boundary redistricting must be completed 90 days prior to an election. So that's important. That's an important deadline rule there. Take note of that one. And the next one is complicated. And so the effect on current elected officials. And I know this is something everybody wants to know about, right? So it really depends on whether the municipality is a statutory town, statutory city, or home rule city. And if it is a home rule city, it also depends on the charter. And so this is straight from the Colorado Municipal League's guidance document that they put out. This is affected municipalities should consult with their attorney for specific direction on this issue. And yeah, you should do that because it is confusing. There are a lot of rules around it. Some officials may be sort of not able to finish out their term based upon redistricting. And in other cases, they may very well be. It really all depends on a number of factors that I'm not going to get into because I'm sure I would screw it up trying to talk about it. So yeah, consult with your attorney and also do reference that guidance document. It is really helpful. And then, so precincts. I do want to mention precincts. I'm not going to get into it too in depth because once again, there is a lot to it and I could talk myself in circles. But ward boundaries cannot split precincts. So precincts also need to be redrawn. So that's something to keep in mind. Those are going to be redrawn after you do the initial redistricting. Okay, so now you might be thinking, well, great, but how are we ever going to get all this done this year? So there's definitely some unique challenges to redistricting this year. So now I just want to give you my advice we're giving our clients now about how do you deal with this. So first off, the unique challenges, right? The census delay. The latest anticipated release date is September 30th. Now, I want to say that I want to mention that the census has been saying that they will also release data on, I believe it's August 16th. It might be August 13th, but either way, it's the middle of August. They are going to release the census data, but they are going to release it in what is known as a legacy format. The legacy format, we interpret that as messy data format. So it's going to be a bit harder to work with is really the reality of it. And that will come out in the middle of August. Our position as a company right now is that we are not currently recommending our clients to use the legacy format data. And our thinking on this could change, but right now we don't know enough about the legacy format data to determine the level of effort that would be required to put it into a format that you can work with. And we can't really say, oh, you should be doing that. We don't know, how much time you're really going to save because we don't know the level of effort required to get that data into a format that's really usable. And then the other key piece to this is the census has said that any organization or agency that does use the legacy format data will have to assume the responsibility, the added risk of there being any mistakes made because of it being in a legacy format. So right now, our advice is to wait and use the real data. And I'll explain a little bit more why we're thinking that in just a minute. But so obviously another challenge of 2021, in case you haven't noticed, kind of in a polarized political climate these days. And an effect of that is redistricting is going to get a lot of attention, probably more attention than it did 10 years ago or 20 years ago. And it's going to affect how you approach this. It should affect how you approach this. You got to think about this a little bit differently than maybe you did 10 years ago. Okay, so with all of that, what can we actually do? How can we make this happen? Okay, first key piece, start now. Really, the delayed census data release is not a reason to delay your redistricting process. If anything, it was a reason to start doing things earlier. So, okay, what can you actually do right now? There's a lot. There's a lot you can do. So the first step, who's going to do it, right? Do you have an internal GIS team that can do it? If you do, you should talk to them and make sure that they have time to do it. You got to remember that if you are an internal GIS team at a city or a town, you have not done this in 10 years, most likely. You're not going to do it super efficiently. That's just the reality. So make sure, if you are going to do it internally, make sure folks know that this is on their plate and that they can start thinking about this analysis too. And so that they're not sort of caught flat-footed there when the data does come out and you need to do this. Do some research, see what happened last time you did this. How did it go? That's going to inform how you approach this. Put it out in an RFP. If you need to go to an RFP, you should be putting it out now, right? That needs to happen sooner rather than later if you're going to need an RFP in order to do this. Start talking with groups in your community, right? Tell them that redistricting is happening. Tell them it's coming. Have them ready to do this work. Have them ready to understand that this is going to happen. Have them ready to provide testimony on their community of interests. There's no reason you can't be out there starting the community engagement piece now, even though the census data isn't available. You can do a lot of that now, and that's going to make everything go smoother down the road. The last thing you want to have happen is have community groups not understand that the census data is coming out and the redistricting is happening, find out at the last minute, and then you have to make revisions and you're already behind schedule because of the census data delay. That's going to be a problem. So start doing that community outreach now, even though you don't have the census data. You can do that. Get a dedicated web page ready. If you're going to have a lot of interest in this, set up a dedicated web page specifically to redistricting, where people know all of the information about redistricting process is going to live, and you can start pointing people there. And then finally, start doing a timeline. There's no reason you can't start scoping out your timeline. You might not have specific dates for everything just yet, but you can get a good sense of what this is going to look like in terms of when you're going to meet certain goals in terms of the process in order to meet the required timelines. And then the last piece I do want to mention, and this is something that we're not recommending for everybody, but if you're a larger community, so maybe had a lot of population change, and the redistricting process is going to be a bit more involved for you, we would recommend that you start looking at some data that's out there right now to help. So specifically, the U.S. Census has data other than the census. They have the American Community Survey. There is population estimates related to that. There are Esri, the GIS company, has large demography team that they put out their own census block estimates, population estimates, and they have population estimates for 2020. There is a associated cost with that, but if there's a chance you may already have access, but that data is out there. This is the Washington Office of Financial Management. Don't check them because you're in Colorado, so I apologize. That's left over from a previous presentation. But with that said, you probably do have a local state office that is also doing population estimates, and it would be worthwhile to look at that as well. And then finally, a lot of counties have important, they're often storing sort of the clearinghouse of a lot of important information that's going to be used in redistricting. You can look at all of this information and really set the stage for redistricting and get an understanding of what the impact is going to be to the district lines you already have in place, by understanding how your demographics and how your population has changed over the past 10 years. So if you can do that, start doing that. An example of that is something that we have been doing for some cases. Once again, we're not recommending it for everybody, but in some cases where they're faced with certain cities and towns or in different states are faced with tighter timelines, we're recommending what's called a baseline analysis. And that's a really nerdy geospatial analysis where you take all of these data points that I mentioned you blend them together, and you look at the census geographies for 2020. Those have been released. And what that is the blocks, the actual physical geographic blocks, the location of the census blocks, but they don't have any data yet. Those have been released. But when you blend all of these other data sources together, what you can do is something you can create essentially your own estimates for your area, and then you do something that's called a aerial interpolation that allows you to allocate based on an algorithm, allocate the population and demographic estimates to each one of these 2020 census blocks. And what that will do for you is, I mean, it's not going to tell you exactly what the census is going to say, but it's likely going to give you a good window into what the census is going to say. And so that can be done not to actually redistrict, but to once again sort of set the table, set the stage for redistricting. So you have some understanding about the impact it's going to have on your community, and you can start doing some more effective community engagement and things like that. So with that said, that is everything I have. I will leave you with a bit of information here, which is some takeaways. Start now, really start now. You know, that just because the data has been delayed is not a reason to delay your redistricting. If anything, given the past year, it's a reason to start now and start doing everything you can ahead of time so that when that data comes, you're ready to go and you're not starting from scratch then. So stuff you can do right now. Don't forget, right? That list there. So, you know, go ahead, get started. I know you've done a lot, and now you get something else this year you got to jump into. But you know, there are things you can do. So start now if you can. So thank you very much. That is all I have. And yeah, thank you. I'm certainly open to take any questions folks might have, and I'll do my best to answer them.
Awesome, John. Thank you so much. We do have a few questions. So just to our attendees, a reminder, if you have a few questions, please type them into the question box so we can get those over to John for him to answer for you. We have two questions here from Alyssa Pappenfort. She is from Salida. The first one is asking what an uncorporated CDP is.
Oh yeah, sorry. I got this in another presentation. It's a census designated place. And basically they are unincorporated areas, but the census has designated them as some sort of an official geographic place, I guess you could say. And there are geographic features associated with them. And by that, I mean they have their own boundaries that the census has sort of designated for them.
Great. And her next question is, does this mean that prisoners from other states are counted there? Which this question did come in a little bit later.
Okay. So I'm just gonna defer here because I don't want to screw it up. This is I'm not a lawyer caveat. I would look specifically, ask your counsel about that act in Colorado, the late accurate population count act. That's not exactly what it's called, but it's in my slide, and you'll have access to this information. So yeah, ask your counsel to speak on that. I don't want to mess that up because I am not a lawyer.
Yes, everyone, as John just mentioned, if you look in the handouts section, you will be able to see this PowerPoint as well as the CML document that John referenced in his presentation. We'll also be putting that on the website. And I just want to remind people, please type your questions into the question box. We're not monitoring the hand raising function. So now I'm going to move on to Colleen Norton's question. Colleen's from Littleton. And the question is, how do you deal with an enclave community, for example, a community not connected by physical boundaries?
An enclave community not connected by physical boundaries, but still within the city or town limits, I assume. So like the city or town has its own island?
She said yes, that's correct.
Okay, yep. So The way you would do that is you would need to include it. So, well, first off, I have not faced that specific example, right? So I want to give you the approach I would take. The approach I would take is first find out how it was done previously. That's always going to be when there is a lot of stuff here and you might face situations that you haven't faced before, but these are done every 10 years. So there is probably some precedent. So first look and see what was done last time and how it was dealt with last time. I would probably start by trying to include that enclave in the district it is geographically closest to. Now, I know I mentioned with islands, you want to include the roads and the things like that within the district that connect them. Obviously, if those roads are not part of your city or town, you can't do that. So yeah, I would start by assuming that you would include it in the district that it is geographically closest to, but then I would, talk to your council and look at precedent, look at what was done previously in those situations in Colorado specifically.
Great. Our next question comes from Zoe out of Fort Lupton. The comment is, we've had annexations over the last 12 years, but they're a statutory city, and there are very few in Colorado. So Zoe is wondering if you can share any specifics for statutory cities.
Once again, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to defer and say read the document because it is, my expertise is on the analysis and the overall process more than it is the specific requirements for different types of cities and towns. That said, we do look at a lot of these things, so I can often speak to it. I don't want to in this case simply because I don't think I'm going to give you the best answer. I would recommend you read that guidance document that CML put out. That is really valuable. I will say that, cities that have had a lot of annexations, we're getting a lot of inquiries there. And I would recommend that you start soon. I mean, I'm recommending that for everybody, but where you've had a lot of annexations, a lot of population changes, and if you have not redistricted since those annexations, you're going to have a lot of work to do. That's just the reality of it, right? There's going to be more change. And so you're going to want to start earlier.
Great, thank you. We do have a few more questions here. Wanda Winkleman from Grand Junction is wondering what the deadline is for redistricting that has to be completed.
So yeah, and that's going to depend on your election, right? So I think as you remember, you have to have it completed within 90 days of an election. So whenever your next election is, it maybe you don't have an election next year, then you need to, if you don't have an election until 2023, you might have a little bit of time, but if you have an election in 2022, you're gonna have less time. So it really depends upon your city and your situation, when your next election is, and the law says 90 days before the next election. So
great. Okay, I have a few questions here from Barbara. The first one is, do we have to use the census data for final redistricting? It's being suggested that we count addresses and assume 2.3 people per address instead.
I've not heard that. So no, you have to use a census. It's pretty clear that you have to use a census. I do believe there are cases that people have said we can't use a census. But once again, I'm not a lawyer. I don't know how those have done or held up in the court. But the generally accepted rule is that the census data is required. I do know that if these are ever challenged in court, the court always defaults to what the census says. So, looking at addresses and making assumptions can be useful in terms of understanding what you think the census is going to say and helping you to start your community engagement piece. But the redistricting process should always be done based upon total population coming from that census.
Great. Our next question also comes from Montrose. It says their next election is April 2022. They are a home rule city. So Barbara's curious if they need to make changes effective at that time, after, or before.
Before, 90 days before.
Great. All right, we have one more from Montrose. It says, we anticipate a lot of growth in the immediate future, subdivisions and apartment buildings that are currently under construction. Do we anticipate this growth when we redistrict, or do we only count growth that has already happened?
Yeah, it's the latter. You only count growth that has already happened. Yeah, so and that's it, right? You're going to use the census. That's your stopping point, that census data, and that's what you're going to use. And that gets back to what happens is if anything were to be challenged, the court isn't going to look at any data other than the census. The census is the only data product that actually truly counts people, that's going around and counting people. All the other products that are out there are done based off small samples and algorithms, whereas a census is an actual count of people. So that's what is always deferred to in any sort of legal challenge or anything like that. And so that's what you have to use when you're doing the redistricting. And that's the stopping point. If you do have, there are ways where if you know something is going to grow and that, maybe you have a rather than like a 0.5% deviation, you're at 3% because you know that in the next year, you've got all these developments that are about to release. You can do some things like that, but only if it fits within those the legal requirements that I mentioned earlier, right? And so, yeah, it is that latter. It's that you only look at the growth that has occurred. That 2020 census is a stopping point.
Great. Okay. Eric from Alamosa is asking, well, he's more of a statement in a way. He says that I thought gerrymandering for political party advantages was an open question still, that the Supreme Court could allow, but your slide says it's not. And he is wondering if you could clarify that a little.
Yeah, no, you can't gerrymander for political parties. They have been overturned. Political gerrymandering has been overturned in a number of states. So no political gerrymandering.
Okay. Don from Longmont asked, in general, how long does the process take, or is there a rule of thumb based on the city size?
Oh, that's a very good question, but it's also unfortunately rather difficult to answer. And what I will say is that the length of time for the process depends upon the amount of outreach that you do. The analysis itself can be done relatively quickly. Our company can do the analysis in a week. However, there's a lot more to doing this than just the analysis, right? You need to communicate, because if you wait and just say we're going to do the analysis and we're just going to adopt those districts, in all likelihood you're going to end up with bigger headaches down the line, because it can really just cause problems with the community, and we would never recommend that. So it really depends upon the amount of outreach you need to do. Like I said, the analysis can be done fairly quickly. Most folks probably can't do it as quickly as we can, simply because we do this all the time. We're always working with this type of data, but the analysis can be done quickly. The outreach, in order to do it effectively, is going to take time. It's going to take a few meetings. So, I think you need to at least give yourself a few months.
Okay, thank you, John. We have two questions left. This one is from Kathy. She says, if we use a third party, what's the minimum amount we should expect to pay?
Oh, well, that's another very difficult question to answer. I totally understand where it's coming from. And once again, I have to get back to the outreach is going to have a huge effect on the amount you have to pay. And the outreach is going to vary depending on your specific community. So the analysis portion, We're working all over the country doing this, and we have some very small special districts that are doing this for as little as $5,000. We are doing this for large counties, and they're paying, over $100,000. So it really varies. If you're a small town that maybe needs to just have one public meeting or something like that, you're gonna still be spending probably around at least $10,000 or something, but it could be a lot more. It could also be a little bit less. So I'm sorry that is not a super specific answer, but it's really the best I can do right now.
All right, and our last one is from Littleton. So Littleton has elections in odd years in November. So they have one this November 2021. So would their redistricting happen after that or before that, since the data won't be available until September 30th?
So, and this is tricky because I'm not there. I mean, according to the law, it is likely needs to happen before. However, I know in other states anyway, and really in lots of states, that in situations like this, there are bills, being progressed. I don't know the situation in Colorado, so I need to sort of defer. But there are things happening to try to, because it's not just Littleton, right? There are other cities, and not just in Colorado, around the country that are facing this conundrum here. And so check and see what the current status is, specifically in Colorado, and if there's any bills looking to see when the redistricting can be done. But yeah, typically it would, need to be done before that election, but you could very well be in a very sort of specific situation. We actually just worked with a client in Georgia that faced this same situation, and it was complicated. We had to have them redistrict based off estimates of what we think the census is going to do. And as you already heard me say, no, you have to use the census data. They were able to do that through some specific laws related to Georgia law, and they also have said, they're immediately going to redistrict again when the census data becomes available, because they had to do it by law beforehand. They then had to default to the best data available, but they're basically forced to redistrict twice in the same year because of that. So, make sure if that's a situation you're facing, talk to your council, see if there's any laws out there in the legislature in order to address this for you and other cities that might be in the same situation.
All right, thank you so much. We do have a comment that sort of answers Kathy Meyer's question. It's from Deacon, and Deacon says that I think you called it ESRI, the ESRI redistricting model, for reference is around $4,500, excuse me.
Okay.
And our last question is from Dylan, and it says, if the state won't have the congressional Senate maps, well, congressional/Senate maps, excuse me, done by December 20th, 2021, and then the county precincts won't be redrawn until after that, sometime in early 2020, wouldn't cities need to wait until 2022 then to redistrict?
Typically, the cities would redistrict their wards prior to that, and then the precincts are drawn around the new ward boundaries. There are additional regulations and laws around the precinct drawing in Colorado. So I don't want to say something that is incorrect, and I apologize if I have. I don't think I have at this point, but once again, I'm not a lawyer hat, so make sure you check with your counsel for specific deadlines. But typically those precincts are drawn after the after the wards have been redistricted at the municipal level.
Awesome. Well, that was our last question. Just a reminder, everyone, you will be able to find the presentation today in the handout. along with the CML document that John was referencing. I did see one more question come in from Barbara, and she's asking if a 5% difference is a lot, John?
Once again, it depends. I mean, a 5% difference in a really small city or town might not be a lot. A 5% difference in a city or town that has 50, 60,000 people is kind of a lot. So, and then it's also important to consider why you have a deviation that high, right? So if you have a deviation that high, but you've managed to preserve every single one of the communities of interest in your city or town, that's probably fine. But if you're still splitting a number of community of interests and things like that, and you have a 5%, then it might not be, right? So it's not super cut and dry, unfortunately.
Awesome. And I do see we are 6 minutes over now, everyone. So I do want to thank you for sticking with us and allowing us to go through these questions. Barbara did say that that was very helpful, so thank you. At this time, I would like to thank everyone for attending today. Thank you, attendees, for being here and joining us. Thank you, John, for sharing this knowledge and presenting for us today. Once again, this information will be put onto our website under training materials. It'll include the PowerPoint and the recording and the document that John referenced by the end of the day. So please keep an eye out for that. And so thank you everyone for joining us. This concludes our webinar, and I hope you all have a nice day.
Great. Thank you so much for having me.